there had always been the white farmhouse with Mom and Dad in it. And there was always a barn with animals and hay and chickens in it. And there was always a field and woods with squirrels and skunks and possums in it. But there wasn't always cousins. Oh, how excited June was that Sunday morning when she woke up and went outside because she saw a big car coming down the driveway towards her house, and it was full of cousins. When the car drove into the driveway, her uncle Jack began to honk, beep, 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 and then all the cousins got out. Uncle Jack got out. Aunt Marie got out. The biggest cousin got out of the car. The next to the biggest cousin got out of the car. The middle cousin, the next to the littlest cousin got out of the car. And finally, they got out the littlest cousin and set her down. June was so excited she was jumping up and down. There were people, lots of people at her farm. She couldn't believe it. And as she jumped up and down, she said, "Hey, you want to see some animals?" And all the cousins shouted, "Yes!" And she said, "Come on!" And so all the cousins took off running behind June as she headed for the barn. She turned back and said, "We've got a baby calf." And they took off running. The biggest cousin, the next to the biggest cousin, the middle cousin, the next to the littlest cousin. And far behind trailed that littlest cousin. She was much smaller than the rest, and her little legs couldn't move as fast. And by the time she got to the barn, June and all the cousins were turned around and were heading out. And she watched them pass her. And she looked at them, and she started to, "Where's everybody going?" And they were gone. June shouted back, "Let's go see the chickens!" And everybody was gone. Right behind June, there was the biggest cousin, the next biggest cousin, the middle cousin, the next to the littlest, and this littlest one trying to keep up with the rest as she ran behind them. Finally, she got to the chicken houses. But when she got there, everyone else was turned around and leaving. And they were headed back towards the barn because June shouted out to them, "We've got kittens too!" And everybody took off running towards the barn behind June. The biggest cousin, the next to the biggest cousin, the middle cousin, the next to the littlest. But the littlest cousin who was trying to run behind started to cry. And when they got to the barn, the cousins started up behind June, the ladder into the haymow. June went up first, and then behind her was the biggest cousin, and the next to the biggest cousin, and then the middle cousin, and the next to the littlest cousin, and finally the littlest cousin stood at the bottom and looked up. It was a long way up to the mow. She looked, and up in the haymow, the rest of them were picking up kittens, and they were rubbing them against their faces, and they were playing with the kittens, and they were so soft, and they were so sweet, and they were talking and smiling and laughing until they heard, and June said, "What's that?" And all the cousins looked down the ladder, and there was the littlest cousin crying. No, she was wailing. "Oh, bother," said the oldest, biggest cousin, and they all climbed down the ladder. The biggest cousin said, "She's always bothering us with stuff like this." The next to the biggest cousin said, "She gets into so much trouble." The middle cousin said, "She just needs help all the time." And the next to the littlest cousin said, "Well, she just wants to see the animals." June looked from cousin to cousin and kept hearing that. And inside June's head, she remembered something. A Bible verse that said, be kind to one another. And June stopped, and she squatted down, and she said to the littlest cousin, you want to see a kitty? Said the little girl. She looked at the biggest cousin. Go get a kitten. So he climbed up the ladder and brought down a kitten. And the little girl held the kitten as she petted the cat. Then June said, would you like to see a calf? Said the littlest cousin. And June looked at the next to the biggest cousin and said, could you lift her up to look inside the stall? Okay, he said. And he called her over to him. And he picked her up so she could look and see the calf. Then June said, would you like to see rabbits? And all the cousins shouted, yes, come on! And June started to run, and then she stopped. And she went back to the littlest cousin, and she took her hand, and she walked with her all the way to the rabbits. And when they got to the rabbits, she set her down on the lawn, and she got out a little bunny and had her hold it. And that's where they were when they heard the voice of her mother calling, lunchtime, come on, kids. She took the rabbit from her littlest cousin and put the rabbit back in the hutch. And then she said, come on, let's go eat. And everybody jumped up, and all the cousins took off running. The biggest cousin, the next to the biggest cousin, the middle cousin, the next to the littlest cousin. But the littlest cousin stood next to June. And June bent over and said, would you like to learn a song? Uh-huh, said the littlest cousin. And June said to her, it goes like this. And she took her hand and she said, let's be kind to one another, one another, one another. Let's be kind to one another. Jesus says, be kind. And the biggest cousin that was already halfway to the house stopped and turned around. And the next to the biggest cousin stopped and turned around. And the middle cousin stopped and turned around. And the next to the littlest cousin turned around. And they all came back and said, teach us that song. So June took the littlest cousin's hand and the next to the littlest cousin's hand, and they all grabbed hold of hands except the biggest cousin, and they all walked towards the house singing, let's be kind to one another. You try it. One another. Help me. One another. Let's be kind to one another. Jesus says, be kind. You can go back to your seats.